"Get out and stay out." The words, roared with the force of a tidal wave, crashed across the polished mahogany of the dining room table. They shattered the fragile peace of our Thanksgiving dinner, a peace I had so desperately tried to maintain. My father, Douglas Hampton, stood at the head of the table, his face a twisted mask of rage and profound disappointment. The festive centerpiece of autumn flowers and miniature gourds suddenly looked garish, a mocking testament to a family harmony that had just been irrevocably broken. The golden-brown Thanksgiving turkey, glistening under the chandelier's light, sat between us, untouched, a monument to the feast we would never share. His words echoed off the high, coffered ceilings of our family home in La Jolla, San Diego, the house I had grown up in, the walls of which had just become a prison I was being expelled from. I sat there, stunned, my fork still halfway to my mouth, a piece of cranberry sauce trembling on the tines. The sweet tartness I usually loved suddenly tasted bitter, metallic, like the coppery tang of betrayal. I felt the familiar weight of his expectations, a pressure I had lived under my entire life, crushing down on me like a physical force. It wasn't a new feeling, but the finality of it stole the air from my lungs. My name is Brielle Hampton. I'm 28 years old, and in that single, brutal moment, I had just shattered my father's most carefully constructed dream for our family legacy. For as long as I could remember, Douglas Hampton had orchestrated every aspect of my life, and my brother's, around one singular, unshakable goal: joining the prestigious Hampton and Associates, the family law firm that bore our name and was his entire identity. He had built it from nothing, a testament to his relentless ambition and iron will, and he expected nothing less from his children. My older brother, Chase, had fallen in line perfectly. At 34, he was the golden child, the walking embodiment of our father's vision. He'd graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Law, passed the bar on his first attempt, and slid seamlessly into his role as a junior partner at the firm. He sat opposite me now, his handsome face a study in discomfort. He wouldn't meet my eyes, his gaze fixed on the intricate pattern of his dinner plate, as if the mashed potatoes held the secrets of the universe. He was a master of strategic silence, a trait he'd learned from our father. Beside my father, my mother, Janine, sat frozen. Her wine glass trembled slightly in her perfectly manicured hands, the only sign of the turmoil beneath her placid surface. She had perfected the art of silent agreement over the years, a beautiful, polished statue that never challenged my father's vision for our family's future. Her silence was its own form of condemnation, a quiet affirmation of his verdict. But I'd always been different. I was the problematic one, the questioner. I was the square peg my father had relentlessly tried to hammer into a round hole. While Chase was memorizing case law, I was volunteering at beach cleanups. While he was networking at bar association mixers, I was drawn to something bigger than billable hours and corporate litigation. My passion wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the world outside, a world I felt an overwhelming urge to fix. The moment I told my father I had officially withdrawn from my second year at Stanford Law, I watched 28 years of his investment in me crumble to dust before his eyes. He had spent decades building Hampton and Associates into one of San Diego's most respected family law practices, a dynasty meant to be passed down through generations. And in his mind, I had just thrown it all away for a childish fantasy. "You're a disgrace to everything this family has built," Douglas continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow felt more threatening than a shouting. His eyes, the same steely blue as my own, were cold, devoid of any warmth I might have once found there. "I've sacrificed everything to give you opportunities you're now spitting on. And this is how you repay me." I set down my fork carefully, the silver clinking softly against the fine china. A cold, hard resolve was settling in my chest, replacing the shock and the hurt. The disappointment wasn't new, but the finality in his voice was. This wasn't a lecture, it was an excommunication. Chase shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but remained silent. Even now, at 34 years old, he couldn't bring himself to defend me against our father's wrath. He was a partner in the firm, but he was still a subordinate in this house. "After everything I've done for you," Douglas said, standing up so abruptly that his chair scraped against the hardwood floor with a sound that made everyone wince. "Get out of my house. Get out and stay out." My mother's sharp intake of breath was the only other sound in the room as I slowly stood up. I didn't cry. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction. I calmly placed my linen napkin beside my plate. The ritual of family dinner had always been a performance in our house, a stage where we all played our designated roles. But tonight, the curtain had finally fallen. As I walked toward the front door, I could feel their eyes on my back, a trinity of disappointment, cowardice, and silent complicity. But nobody called out to stop me. The silence spoke louder than any words could have. Growing up in the Hampton household meant living under the constant, suffocating pressure of achievement and appearances. My father had built his reputation on the foundation of family values and legacy, ironically while emotionally distancing himself from his own children. He didn't want a daughter. He wanted a successor. Chase had always been the golden child, the one who asked the right questions and made the right choices, at least in our father's eyes. He had seamlessly transitioned into the family business without ever questioning whether it was what he truly wanted. I, on the other hand, had always been the problematic daughter. While Chase studied corporate law and taxation, I found myself drawn to environmental science and social entrepreneurship during my undergraduate years at UC San Diego. I spent my summers volunteering with sustainable development organizations instead of interning at prestigious law firms my father had lined up. My father tolerated these phases, as he called them, as long as I maintained my grades and stayed on track for law school. The tension between us had been building for years, a low, simmering resentment that finally reached its breaking point during my second year at Stanford Law. I was sitting in a contracts class, listening to a gray-haired professor drone on about breach remedies, when I realized with a gut-wrenching clarity that I was slowly dying inside. Every case study felt like another nail in the coffin of my authentic self. That evening, I called my old roommate from UC San Diego, Maya. She was now working with a female-led venture capital group in Los Angeles called Viridian Capital. I told her about my growing disillusionment and the idea that had been taking root in my mind for months. "I have an idea," I told her, pacing around my tiny apartment near campus, the energy buzzing through me. "Solar-powered infrastructure kits for developing communities. Simple, plug-and-play systems that can provide clean energy and internet connectivity to remote areas." The technology already existed, but nobody had figured out how to make it accessible and affordable for the communities that needed it most. I had been researching the concept for months, sketching out business models on napkins and staying up late reading about microfinance and social impact investing. "You should pitch this to Viridian Capital," Maya suggested, her voice filled with an excitement that mirrored my own. "They're looking for exactly this kind of innovation." That conversation changed everything. The Thanksgiving dinner was the catalyst. Being cast out with such venom was the final push I needed. I left La Jolla that night with nothing but my beat-up car, my laptop, and a few $100s in my bank account. The weight of my father's expectations was gone, but it was replaced by the terrifying, exhilarating freedom of having absolutely nothing to lose. Within a week, I had quietly, officially withdrawn from Stanford. My parents, I later learned, thought I was taking a temporary leave of absence to find myself. I let them believe it. I moved to a cramped, shared co-working space in Venice Beach, a world away from the manicured lawns of La Jolla. For 9 agonizing months, I lived off my dwindling savings and a diet that consisted primarily of instant ramen noodles. I poured every ounce of my energy into my company, which I named Sunna Systems. I submitted proposals to 17 different investment groups and received 17 rejections. Some were form letters, cold and impersonal. Others were more personalized, with feedback about market viability and scalability concerns that stung but also strengthened my resolve. Each rejection was a blow, but it also taught me something valuable about resilience and determination. My brother, Chase, called occasionally to check in, but our conversations always felt stilted and careful, as if we were both afraid of saying the wrong thing. He was busy with a high-profile divorce case that was generating significant media attention for Hampton and Associates, and I could tell he was frustrated by my apparent lack of direction. In his mind, I was wasting my potential while he was building his career and contributing to the family legacy. "Dad's really worried about you," he said during one of our rare phone calls. "He thinks you're having some kind of quarter-life crisis." I almost laughed at the irony. While my family was worried about my supposed crisis, I was building something that I knew, with every fiber of my being, could change the world. Something that would outlast my father's law firm by decades. But I kept that knowledge to myself. The revelation would be so much sweeter if it came as a complete surprise. The breakthrough came on a rain-soaked Tuesday in March, exactly 9 months after I had started this lonely journey. I was sitting in the cramped Venice Beach co-working space, surrounded by a graveyard of empty coffee cups and crumpled papers, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something told me to answer it. "Brielle Hampton?" a professional, female voice asked. "Speaking," I said, my heart starting to pound. "This is Jessica Chun from Viridian Capital. We'd like to schedule a meeting about your Sunna Systems proposal." My hands started shaking as I processed her words. Viridian Capital was one of the most respected social impact investment firms on the West Coast, led by women who had made their fortunes in tech and were now dedicated to funding companies that could create positive change. I had submitted my proposal to them 4 months earlier and had assumed it had been lost in the shuffle when I never heard back. The meeting took place the following week in their sleek, minimalist downtown Los Angeles office. I wore my only professional suit, a slightly too tight navy blue number from my law school days, and carried a worn leather portfolio that had belonged to my grandfather, a man who had always encouraged my unconventional ideas. The conference room overlooked the sprawling city skyline, and I tried not to let the intimidating setting shake my confidence. Jessica introduced me to the other partners. Dr. Amara Okafor, a brilliant Nigerian-born engineer who had revolutionized water purification technology, and Lisa Brennan, a former Goldman Sachs executive who had left Wall Street to focus on sustainable investing. These were women who had broken barriers and created their own paths, and I felt a spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, they would understand my vision. I presented my solar infrastructure concept with passionate precision. I explained how modular energy systems could be deployed in rural communities across Africa and South America. The technology wasn't just about providing electricity, it was about creating connectivity, enabling education, and empowering local economies. Each kit would include solar panels, battery storage, LED lighting, and satellite internet capability, I explained, clicking through slides that demonstrated the scope of energy poverty worldwide. 2 billion people still lack access to reliable electricity, and traditional grid infrastructure is prohibitively expensive for remote communities. Dr. Okafor leaned forward, her eyes bright and clearly engaged. "What's your scalability model? How do you plan to manufacture and distribute these systems affordably?" I had anticipated this question. I had spent weeks developing partnerships with manufacturers in Southeast Asia who specialized in renewable energy components. The key is creating standardized modules that can be produced efficiently while maintaining quality standards. "We partner with established manufacturers and focus on assembly and deployment," I replied. "Our value proposition isn't in reinventing solar technology, it's in making it accessible and sustainable for communities that need it most." The meeting lasted 2 hours, and by the end, I could see genuine excitement in their eyes. Jessica walked me to the elevator. "We'll be in touch soon," she said with a warm smile. "This is exactly the kind of innovation we're looking for." That evening, I called Maya to share the news, but I didn't tell my family. They still thought I was on a temporary break from law school. The official call from Viridian Capital came 3 weeks later, and it changed everything. Jessica's voice was warm but professional as she delivered the news that would transform my life. "Brielle, We'd like to offer Sunnis Systems $30 million in Series A funding, with an additional commitment for Series B if you hit your first-year deployment targets. I nearly dropped the phone. $30 million. It was more money than I had ever imagined, enough to launch operations across 3 continents and establish the manufacturing partnerships we needed to scale rapidly. The terms are generous, too, Jessica continued. Viridian will take a 40% stake in the company, leaving you with controlling interest and the freedom to operate according to your vision. There's one condition. My breath caught in my throat. What is it? We want you to accept a position on the California Renewable Council. It's a state advisory board that evaluates green energy initiatives and distributes federal grants. Your expertise would be valuable, and it would give Sunnis Systems additional credibility in the market. The California Renewable Council was prestigious, composed of leading experts in sustainable technology and environmental policy. Membership was by invitation only, typically reserved for seasoned executives with decades of experience. At 28, I would be one of the youngest appointees in the council's history. I'm honored, I replied, my voice barely a whisper, still processing the sheer magnitude of what was happening. When would I start? Immediately. We're announcing the funding next month, and the council appointment will be part of the press release. This is going to put you on the map in a big way, Brielle. After hanging up, I sat in stunned silence in my tiny Venice Beach apartment. 9 months ago, I had been a dropout law student, eating ramen noodles and questioning every decision I had ever made. Now, I was about to become the chief strategy officer of a $30 million company with operations spanning multiple continents. The next few weeks passed in a blur of legal documents, media interviews, and strategic planning sessions. Viridian's team helped me establish a proper corporate structure, hire key personnel, and begin the process of setting up manufacturing partnerships. I moved out of my cramped apartment and into a modern loft in Santa Monica, finally able to afford furniture that didn't come from thrift stores. The press coverage was overwhelming. TechCrunch featured Sunnis Systems as one of the top social impact startups to watch, and Forbes included me in their 30 Under 30 list for social entrepreneurship. The attention was gratifying, but also surreal. I kept expecting someone to tap me on the shoulder and tell me there had been a mistake. Through it all, my family remained oblivious to my success. I had perfected the art of deflecting their questions about my plans, giving vague answers about exploring opportunities and taking time to figure things out. My father had stopped asking altogether after our last uncomfortable phone conversation, when he had again suggested I consider returning to law school before it was too late. Chase called occasionally, but our conversations felt increasingly distant. The disconnect was painful. I found myself caught between the desire to share my achievements and the strategic value of maintaining my secret. Part of me wanted to prove to my father that I had made the right choice, that dropping out of law school had led to something far more meaningful than a partnership in his firm. But another part of me recognized that the element of surprise would be more powerful than a gradual revelation. The week before Thanksgiving, I made a decision that would change everything. I purchased a $7 million oceanfront mansion in Malibu, complete with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Pacific Ocean and a private beach access. The house was a symbol of my success, but more importantly, it was a statement of independence. I was no longer the lost daughter, living on borrowed time and good intentions. The real estate transaction generated its own media attention, as celebrity news outlets speculated about the young tech executive who had purchased one of Malibu's most exclusive properties. The attention made me nervous, but I assumed my family was too focused on their own concerns to notice entertainment news about property purchases. I spent the days leading up to Thanksgiving carefully preparing for what I knew would be a difficult and final conversation. 3 weeks after that first fateful Thanksgiving, I was reviewing grant applications in my home office when my assistant called with an urgent update. Brielle, I thought you should know that Hampton and Associates submitted an application for the State Renewable Energy Grant Program. They're requesting $2 million for a sustainability initiative. I almost laughed out loud. Hampton and Associates had never shown any interest in environmental issues during my entire childhood. The fact that they were suddenly pursuing green energy grants seemed like a transparent attempt to capitalize on the growing market for sustainable legal services. What's the nature of their application? I asked, pulling up the California Renewable Council database on my computer. They're proposing to establish a pro bono legal clinic focused on environmental justice issues, she explained. The grant would fund 3 years of operations, including staff salaries and community outreach programs. As a council member, I had access to review all grant applications before they were evaluated by the full committee. I opened Hampton and Associates' submission and read through it carefully, noting the ambitious goals and impressive-sounding initiatives. The proposal was well-written and professionally presented, exactly what I would have expected from my father's firm. But there was one critical problem, one that the other council members wouldn't immediately recognize. Hampton and Associates had no experience in environmental law, no existing relationships with environmental justice organizations, and no track record of supporting sustainable initiatives. The application was essentially a request for $2 million to enter a field they had never shown interest in pursuing. More importantly, there was a clear conflict of interest that would disqualify their application automatically. I scrolled to the bottom of the council database entry and found the field I was looking for: potential conflicts. I typed carefully, knowing that my words would determine the fate of my father's grant application. Sunnis Systems Executive Relationship, I wrote, adding my name and title for clarity. The rejection would be swift and public, visible to everyone in San Diego's legal community. As I submitted the conflict notice that would deny my father's grant application, I realized that revenge had found me, rather than the other way around. The path I had chosen for authentic reasons had led to a moment of perfect justice that no amount of planning could have orchestrated better. Sometimes, the best revenge is simply living successfully according to your own values and letting the consequences reveal themselves naturally. As Thanksgiving approached, the tension between my two worlds became almost unbearable. In the business world, I was being recognized as an innovative leader in sustainable technology. Sunnis Systems had deployed our first pilot programs in Kenya and Guatemala, providing clean energy to over 5,000 people in remote communities. The success stories were pouring in: children studying by LED light instead of dangerous kerosene lamps, small businesses operating refrigeration units for the first time, and community centers offering internet access for education and communication. But to my family, I was still the disappointing daughter who had thrown away her legal career for undefined pursuits. The morning of Thanksgiving, I drove from my new Malibu mansion to my parents' house in La Jolla, taking the scenic coastal route that had always calmed my nerves. The familiar neighborhoods looked different now that I was viewing them from a position of financial success rather than dependence. I parked my new Tesla outside the house where I had grown up, noting how modest it seemed compared to my new estate. My mother greeted me at the door with her usual mixture of affection and concern. "Brielle, you look wonderful. How are you feeling about everything?" Everything was her diplomatic way of referring to my extended absence from law school without acknowledging the growing elephant in the room. I hugged her and followed her into the kitchen, where the familiar sounds and smells of Thanksgiving preparation transported me back to childhood memories of family gatherings that had felt warmer and more genuine. Chase arrived with his girlfriend, Kelly. They made the perfect legal power couple, discussing recent cases and bar association politics with the easy confidence of people who had never questioned their career paths. Kelly had always been polite to me, but I could sense her confusion about my current status as the family disappointment. As we gathered around the dining room table, I knew this would be the last Thanksgiving where my family saw me as a failure. The conversation I had been dreading began innocently enough. We had finished the main course, and my mother was clearing plates while my father poured wine with the ceremonial precision he brought to everything. "Brielle," my father said suddenly, turning his attention to me with a focused intensity that had intimidated me since childhood. "I've been patient about this whole sabbatical situation, but we need to talk about your plans. Spring semester starts in 2 months, and if you're going to re-enroll at Stanford, We need to handle the paperwork soon. The assumption in his voice was clear. Of course, I would be returning to law school, because what other reasonable option could there be? My mother nodded encouragingly from the kitchen doorway, clearly hoping this conversation would resolve the uncertainty that had been hanging over our family gatherings. Actually, Dad, I said, setting down my wine glass carefully, I'm not taking a sabbatical. I officially withdrew from Stanford 8 months ago. The silence that followed was deafening. Kelly stopped mid-sentence in her conversation with Chase, and I could see my mother's face pale as she processed what I had just said. My father's expression shifted from confusion to anger so quickly that I almost flinched. You what? He said, his voice dangerously quiet. I withdrew from law school, I repeated, meeting his gaze directly. I realized it wasn't the right path for me, so I left to pursue something else. Chase leaned forward, clearly trying to mediate before the situation exploded. Brielle, maybe we can discuss options for reapplying next year. There are other good law schools that might. You don't understand, I interrupted, my voice calm but firm. I'm not planning to return to law school. Ever. I've started a company, and it's been incredibly successful. My father's face was turning red, and I could see the vein in his temple that always appeared when he was truly angry. A company? What kind of company? Some little internet startup that will be bankrupt in 6 months. Sunnis Systems, I said simply. We develop solar-powered infrastructure for developing communities. We just closed $30 million in series of funding. The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. I watched my family's faces as they tried to process what I had just told them. $30 million was more money than Hampton and Associates had generated in revenue over its entire 30-year history. That's impossible, my father said flatly. You've been out of school for 8 months. Nobody raises that kind of money without experience or credentials. I have both, I replied calmly. I spent 2 years developing the technology and business model while I was supposedly studying contracts and torts. And as of last month, I was appointed to the California Renewable Council. Kelly's eyes widened with recognition. The Renewable Council? That's incredibly prestigious. My firm has tried to get clients appointed to that board for years. My father stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that made everyone wince. You're lying, he said, his voice filled with a combination of rage and disbelief. This is some elaborate fantasy you've constructed to justify throwing away your education. I'm not lying, I said, remaining seated while he towered over me. But clearly, you'd rather believe that I'm delusional than accept that I've succeeded without following your plan. That's when he exploded with the words that would end our relationship forever. The same words from a year ago, but this time they held no power over me. The next morning, I drove straight from my parents' house to my new Malibu mansion, my father's words still echoing in my ears. Get out and stay out, had been his final statement before I walked out of their dining room for what I knew would be the last time. The 20-minute drive along the Pacific Coast Highway gave me time to process what had just happened and to plan my next steps. My phone had been buzzing constantly since I left La Jolla, with missed calls from Chase and several text messages from my mother asking me to call them back. I ignored them all. The time for explanations and reconciliation had passed the moment my father chose to believe his own assumptions rather than listen to the truth about my success. The moving truck arrived at noon, carrying the minimal belongings I had accumulated during my years of struggling to build Sunnis Systems. Everything fit easily into 2 rooms of my sprawling new home, a stark reminder of how dramatically my circumstances had changed. As I unpacked my laptop and the framed photo of my first solar installation in Kenya, I felt a mixture of sadness and liberation that surprised me with its intensity. That afternoon, I called Jessica at Viridian Capital to discuss the timeline for our expansion into Central America. The conversation was energizing, focusing on concrete plans for deploying our technology to communities that desperately needed reliable energy access. As we talked about manufacturing partnerships and government approvals, I realized how much more fulfilling this work was than any legal career could have been. By the way, Jessica mentioned near the end of our call, we're getting some interesting inquiries about potential partnerships. Several law firms are reaching out about pro bono opportunities to support our community development work. Really? I said, suddenly interested. What kind of firms? Mostly environmental law specialists, but a few family practices too. There's apparently significant interest in the corporate social responsibility angle. I made a mental note to review those partnership proposals carefully. The irony of law firms wanting to associate with my success wasn't lost on me, especially considering my father's complete dismissal of my achievements just hours earlier.